This is the RAZER Atlas Pro, Razer's long overdue refresh and follow-up to the first ever hard pad that released all the way back in 2023. Now, while there were some positives to the original Atlas as it performed surprisingly well, its design was quite outdated compared to competitors' offerings at the time, mainly due to its 5mm thickness, which made the original Atlas quite underwhelming despite its good performance. But with the release of the Atlas Pro here, to Razer's credit, they have somewhat improved the Atlas, mainly by altering its thickness, material, and dimensions. But aside from those changes, Razer's marketing for the pad is very vague, and there doesn't appear to be any other significant modifications made to the pad, as it actually performs essentially one-to-one to the original Atlas. Meaning that while the pad maintains the same performance of its predecessor, it also inherits many of its flaws, resulting in the Atlas Pro, just like the original Atlas, feeling rather outdated in today's hard pad market despite the modifications made to it. So in today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the Atlas Pro and talk in depth about its design, core materials, coding, manufacturing processes, performance profiles, pros and cons, and much more. But before we dive in, big thank you to Razer for sending over the Atlas Pro for review, and a massive thank you to all of our channel members for their continued support. And if you enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and get subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any future hard pad reviews. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning we get my honest opinions about the Atlas Pro and every other product I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used both colorways of the Atlas Pro for around 4 weeks, daily driving the pad for both work and gaming use. For skates used, I initially tested both the pads with the stock skates on my Viper V4 Pro, but as usual for a hard pad review, I also tested a variety of aftermarket skate options to see how they altered the pad's performance profile, and we'll talk all about this later in this video. And for sleeve usage, I used several sleeve types over my testing as they improved the pad's usage experience just as they did in the original Atlas, especially when it comes to the pad's build-up issues, which are still present here, but we'll talk more about this aspect of the pad later in this video as well. For versions, the Atlas Pro comes in both white and black colorways, and the pad is available in only one size as of recording this review, a 500 by 400 by 1.9mm size that retails for 179 Canadian dollars, which is a very steep price in my opinion, especially when compared to competitors' hard pads. However, since this is a Razer product, the Atlas Pro has the advantage of being available in retail stores, meaning you can try the pad out and return it much easier than you can other brands' hard pads, at least up here in Canada. Another notable aspect to the Atlas Pro here is that Razer is offering a 30-day trial period, meaning you can try the pad out, and if you don't like it, Razer will cover the cost of the return, which is a really cool concept, as one of the biggest hurdles users face when trying a glass pad is their inability to return them in most cases, and this trial period makes it much easier for customers to try the Atlas Pro, hence why I'm glad to see Razer offer this option, and hopefully other brands will follow suit with similar trial periods for their offerings, as that would be a great way for more users to try out various hard pad types. For packaging, the Atlas Pro comes in packaging that is essentially identical to that of the original Atlas, which is designed in the typical Razer style, with the front and sides listing some preliminary information about the pad, just with a few added warnings about handling the pad due to its thinner nature. On the back of the box, we'll find more expanded information about the pad, including its base style, surfacing, and thickness, but notably, they advertise that the pad is optimized for optical sensors and that it's resistant to dirt and scratches, and that it's made of a premium tempered glass. This in particular, as we'll talk about later, is an interesting claim given the pad's thinness, and we'll talk more about these interesting claims later in this video. Opening the box, we'll find the Atlas Pro nested inside a bunch of protective foam. However, unlike the packaging used for other hard pad types, there's no foam pad under the lid to protect the pad surface, as Razer opted just to use 2 thin foam strips instead. This is something I'm not exactly a fan of, as the pad is adequately protected on all its other sides, which actually saved my white copy from an impact, but if a similar impact were to happen on the surface of the box, the probability of the pad being damaged is much higher than it would be on other pad types due to the lack of foam. And considering the pad's thinner design and how rough shipping couriers can be, or how you'll likely need to reuse the packaging to transport the pad, I would love to see Razer update their packaging to use a full-size foam pad on the box top on future batches to ensure the pad is properly protected. Aside from the lacking protective foam, removing the pad from its foam nest. In the base of the package we'll find a quick start guide which lists the pad's care and cleaning instructions as well as some more handling guidelines. And as per for Razer's manuals, inside there is also a sheet of Razer stickers, the same style as the ones included with their mice. But to my extreme disappointment, and just like the original Atlas, the Atlas Pro doesn't include any additional accessories such as a cleaning cloth arm sleeve or skates, which is extremely disappointing considering the pad's price and that I criticized the lack of accessories when I reviewed the original Atlas. This is an area where the Atlas falls short compared to competitors' offerings, as they include many of the aforementioned missing accessories from the Atlas Pro while also retailing for a cheaper MSRP. And lastly, for warranty coverage, the Atlas Pro has a 1-year manufacturer warranty, and you can find the terms and conditions for said warranty over on Razer's website. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my pads were sent to me directly by Razer, so take the build quality and QC of my units with a grain of salt. But that said, since this is a hard pad which are inherently more consistent than fabric pad types, unsurprisingly both of my Atlas Pros are pretty much perfect despite their thinner design, with no noticeable issues with the pad's material, coating, surfacing, or base installations. And over my testing period, I didn't notice any uneven areas on either of the pads nor any dead zones in their surfacing, which is impressive given the pad's thinner nature, so props to Razer as the pad's build quality and QC is quite good, at least on this batch. However, as mentioned earlier, since Razer has kept the same surfacing and coating found on the original Atlas, this pad has inherited many of the issues found on the original Atlas, and we're going to talk more about those in just a moment. Moving on to material, Razer is advertising that the Atlas Pro is made of premium tempered glass, the same material advertised to be used in the original Atlas, just in a thinner 1.1mm form factor. However, as it turns out, the core material isn't the same, as Razer confirmed to me that the glass's material in the Atlas Pro is actually aluminosilicate glass, not the traditional soda lime tempered glass that was used in the original Atlas. Now, given the glass's thinner form factor, I initially assumed the material was some form of aluminosilicate, but oddly, unlike other brands, Razer wouldn't divulge any further information regarding the material or many other aspects of the pad, as you'll see later in this video, which I thought was quite odd seeing as their marketing for the pad was already quite vague. Because of this, I've gone to some extreme lengths to try and ID the material used inside the Atlas Pro, and based on several of its traits, the glass doesn't exactly align with the properties you'd expect to find on aluminosilicate glass, especially when it comes to durability, as I've never seen an aluminosilicate hard pad shatter this easily. As such, and since I couldn't get any official confirmations, I assume that the pad's material is indeed a type of aluminosilicate material. However, it is the lowest quality type I've seen used in a hard pad to date, hence why its properties don't exactly align with the higher quality aluminosilicate glass that was used on the Lock-On Odyssey and the Glassworks Polarity and a myriad of other hard pads. But regardless of the lower quality material used here, aluminosilicate does have some advantages over traditional tempered glass types, as instead of its strengthening agent being calcium oxide like in traditional soda lime glass types, in this material type aluminum oxide is added to it, which acts as a network former, bridging the gaps that form at the ends of the silica molecules, resulting in the material's molecular structure being a tightly woven mesh instead of the looser molecular structure you'll find on traditional glass pad types such as soda lime glass. And this stronger structure normally gives this material its aforementioned benefits without the need for a traditional tempering process used to strengthen other glass types. Meaning that in theory, this material is more durable and will only be damaged by materials with an equal or higher hardness, or if it's exposed to a highly acidic compound, but as I mentioned earlier, this glass's material appears to be of a lower quality given its various properties, meaning that its increased durability isn't as pronounced as compared to higher quality aluminosilicate materials used in other hard pad types. But as is expected for a hard pad, the pad's aluminosilicate material has been tempered quote unquote, but again Razer wouldn't specify any specifics about what processing was used to do this. But given the material and its increased hardness, there's only a few tempering methods that actually work on this material, and the most common type is an ion exchange process, which is likely being used here, as that is the same tempering process we've seen used on other aluminosilicate hard pads. In this process, sodium ions are swapped for potassium ions in the pad surface, and due to their larger ionic radius, this process jams them into the glass's molecular structure, transforming the surface of the glass into a layer of compressive stress. This ion exchange process is a notable improvement over the traditional tempering processes often used on other glass pad types, in which the glass is strengthened by heating the material to its softening point, then blasting it with cold air to return the surface to a solid state. And while the processes yield a similar result, there can be issues with this, as the cooling process can cause distortions in the material's surfacing or other inconsistencies, whereas the aforementioned ion exchange process can't introduce any distortions into the pad's surface, while also offering a stronger tempering to the material. Now, to be clear, this is just a guess on my end, as Razer could be using other tempering processes. However, given that this is the process used by most hard pad types that are made of aluminosilicate, I assume this is what Razer is using here on the Atlas Pro. However, as mentioned earlier, the reason for the weaker strengthening here appears to be due to the lower quality material likely used here in combination with its thinness, as there's a massive quality between high quality aluminosilicate materials and lower quality copies or variants. Now, the pad's 1.9mm form factor is a great feature from a marketing perspective, and as while of now, the Atlas Pro does hold the title for the world's thinnest hard pad, a title that will be hotly disputed in the future, there have definitely been some sacrifices made to achieve this thinness, which is a trade-off I'm not exactly sure was worth it here, seeing as the pad's material isn't as durable as other, thicker, higher quality aluminosilicate materials, especially considering the pad's price and its other interesting traits. And as a last material related note, due to the material's thinner nature and dubious quality, one issue I can foresee happening here is batch consistency, as from a manufacturing perspective, thinner glass types, even thinner aluminosilicate types, but especially lower quality ones, can have minor differences in their materials, meaning that there's the potential for future batches to have differing performance profiles, durability, thermal properties, or even degrees of chemical resistances. However, if the manufacturer Razer is using for the Atlas Pro has very tight QC, said variances might not be an issue, but again, this heavily relies on the factory's QC and the quality of the material, so we'll just have to wait and see how future batches of the Atlas Pro perform compared to the first batch units. For surfacing, Razer is advertising the Atlas Pro features a familiar 2mm micro etch texturing, which is, funnily enough, the exact same surfacing type that was advertised to be used on the Atlas V1 surface. But one odd aspect to the surfacing here is that Razer is advertising that it's been lab tested with their leading sensor partner, who is Pixart if you don't already know, to ensure consistent, accurate tracking across fast flicks and fine micro adjustments, specifically with optical sensors. This is a first for me, as I've never seen a hard pad surface being tested this way, at least publicly, and there's a good reason for this, as all of Pixar's sensors are already compatible with essentially every hard pad type, and can even track on transparent glass that's 4mm or thinner. Meaning that this advertised lab testing just means they had Pixar verify that their compatible sensors were compatible with the surface, which they already were, which is why I'm really confused as why they're even advertising this as a feature here on the Atlas Pro. Now, aside from the odd marketing here, moving on to the surfacing and the texturing type used here, unsurprisingly, Razer again wouldn't confirm any specifics, which isn't exactly surprising given the vagueness of the pad's marketing, but since the pad is supposedly made of aluminosilicate glass, since this material is stronger than traditional glass types, there's only a few etching processes that could have been used here, similar to how this material can only be tempered in a few ways. Now, generally speaking, most if not all aluminosilicate pads have their surface texturing etched via a wet etch process, which is done by dipping the pad surface into an acid bath which eats away at the glass's silica, resulting in a texturing being etched into the surface. Now, wet etching processes for the most part are very consistent and free of the redeposition or consistency issues that can occur from dry etching processes. However, since Razer didn't provide any specifics about the pad's etching process, the texturing's RA and RZ values are unknown. Now, on my units, thankfully, both of them feel the same, but I do worry about consistency on future batches, as if the material quality changes, the pad's texturing and its respective RA and RZ can vary, which can lead to batch variance. But like I said before, if the factory's QC is super tight, there shouldn't be any issues, but again, we'll have to wait and see how consistent future batches of the Atlas Pro are in this regard. And since the Atlas Pro uses the exact same same surfacing type we saw in the Atlas V1, the feel and performance profile of the pad is unsurprisingly nearly identical to that of the V1, having the same smooth, lightly textured feel to it. But since this is a V2 of sorts, I'm really surprised Razer didn't alter the pad's surface texturing to improve and differentiate it from the V1, but instead they opted to go the safe route just as they did with the Gigantus V2 Pro series pads, which is fine, but the pad's performance profile does feel a little generic compared to the other hard pad types available on the market, specifically more modern ones. And in terms of sensor compatibility, over my testing I used 3395, 3950, 3955, and 3970 series sensors on both the black and white versions of my Atlas Pro, and over my testing I didn't experience any tracking or other noteworthy issues. I also did test the Logitech Hero 2 and the GPX2 and the Super Strike, and I also didn't run into any issues on that sensor. However, seeing as I've had spin-out issues with the Hero 2 on other hardpad types before, it wouldn't surprise me if you were to run into issues at some point, but that's due to the oddities of the Hero 2, not the pad surfacing. And as a last surfacing related note here, just as we saw in the Atlas V1, disappointingly the Razer logo is still printed onto the pad surface, meaning that if you run your mouse over the logo it feels quite rough and can even cause tracking issues in some cases. But since the pad comes in better dimensions than the previous version, the printed logo isn't as much of an issue as it was in the previous iteration, but regardless, this is something Razer should address on future batches, as the logo should absolutely be under the glass to prevent any potential, albeit rare, issues when utilizing the pad. Moving on to coating, and just like the original Atlas, the Atlas Pro has a coating applied to its surface, as the majority of hardpad types do, but oddly, the original Atlas got a lot of backlash for having a coating as it supposedly had durability issues, but as I talked about when I reviewed that pad, the coating was applied well, and I didn't have nor have I experienced any coating-related issues with the pad to date, and I assume that trend will continue here with the Atlas Pro. However, just like many other aspects of this pad, Razer yet again wouldn't confirm much information about the coating aside from saying that the coating is the same type as the Atlas V1, meaning that yet again and frustratingly I'm left to guess at the coating type used here and its application method. Now generally speaking, most hard pads including the original Atlas use hydrophobic and oleophobic coatings, but depend on the composition of said coating, their performance and resistances can vary significantly, but based on my testing, the Atlas Pro's coating is essentially identical in feel and performance to the original Atlas's coating, which is very much a double-edged sword, unfortunately. Now, if you're not familiar with how coatings are applied to hard pads, there are a variety of methods that are frequently utilized by other hard pad types, such as thermal, evaporation, or ion-assisted deposition processes, but since we have no specifics about the coating's composition or application type, there's sadly no way for me to ID the application method used here, which means unfortunately I can't speak to the coating's durability, as depending on the application type and its composition, there could be a degree of variance to this aspect of the pad as well, and yet again, the consistency of a hard pad's coating heavily depends on the factory's QC, meaning that depending on the coating's application method and composition, again there is the potential for batch variance here if Razer's QC isn't extremely tight. But regardless of the continued vagueness around the pad's coating and application type, I did test its durability by scratching it with steel wool for around 2 minutes, and there doesn't appear to be any damage to the pad's coating or surfacing, and considering this is a pretty extreme test and you'll never be exposing the surface of the pad to this type of wear and tear during normal use, the coating of the Atlas Pro will likely be durable and consistent, though again this heavily depends on QC. But I will say, over my testing periods, I haven't run into any coating related issues with either of my Atlas Pros, but we'll have to wait and see how the pads hold up over long-term use and from batch to batch. But since the coating passed the scratch test, I don't foresee any long-term issues with the Atlas Pro's coating, at least on this batch. For performance profiles, and just like the original Atlas, the performance marketing for the pad is quite vague, as is the rest of the marketing, with no specific performance profile mentioned on the website, and the only description I could find was Razer stating that the pad had effortless glide, quote unquote, but aside from that, there's literally nothing else that gives you any idea of how the pad performs, which is very concerning, especially in today's hard pad market, as competitors offer much more detailed and accurate descriptions of how their hard pad performs. But since the Atlas Pro is a a hard pad, obviously it will be faster than many traditional soft pad types, including all the Gigantus V2 Pro series pads, with the exception of the max speed since it hasn't released as of recording this video. But compared to other hard pad types, and just like the original Atlas, the Atlas Pro falls into the balanced performance profile based on my testing, which can of course be altered depending on the skate type used. And oddly enough, much like the Gigantus V2 Pro series pads, which had very safe performance profiles, the same applies here with the Atlas Pro, as a balanced performance profile is a very safe profile for a hard pad type. Now to be clear, this is fine by all means, but as I mentioned earlier, seeing as this is a V2 of sorts, I wish they tweaked the pad's performance profile to differentiate it and improve it coming from its previous iteration, as an improved performance profile would have made the pad more competitive in today's hard pad market. But since the performance profile is essentially identical to the V1, while the pad does perform well, it definitely feels outdated compared to more modern hard pad types that utilize more advanced surfacings and coatings. Now, before I talk about the pad's various performance profiles, a quick preface here. Since this is a hard pad and just like all other hard pad types, keep in mind that you can only use felt, plastic, PTFE, hardened PTFE, and ultra-high molecular polyethylene or UHMWP material skates on it, as using other skate types such as gems, ceramic, glass, metal, or any other harder material skate can damage the pad over long-term use, and as such I'm going to focus on the performance and feel of the Atlas Pro when using traditional skate types. Starting off with the traditional skate type being 100% PTFE material skates, due to the lower friction coefficient of this material, this skate type offers the smoothest and fastest glide, giving the pad lower degrees of initial dynamic and braking frictions, and altering the pad's performance profile to a speed balance profile. This altered performance profile makes the pad well suited for dynamic and tracking aim and game types. It still can be used for static and flicking aim and game types as well, but the lack of braking frictions might be an issue in this use case. But while this skate type gives the pad its fastest performance profile, keep in mind that PTFE, due to its softer nature, has very poor durability on all hard pad surfaces, meaning you'll have to replace these skates more frequently to ensure consistent performance. And for audio feedback, here's how some PTFE skates sound on the Atlas Pro. Moving on to hardened PTFE material skates, such as the stock skates found in the Viper V3 and V4 Pro. While this skate type is made of the same material as 100% PTFE skates, it's undergone a hardening process which alters the material's friction coefficients and improves its durability. This hardening gives this skate type a slightly rougher, semi-controlled glide compared to pure PTFE skates that increase the degrees of initial, dynamic, and braking frictions you'll experience on the pad. This gives the Atlas Pro a balanced performance profile, one that's quite well suited for both static and flicking as well as dynamic and tracking aim and game types. However, this skate type does need to be worked into a hard pad surface before use, which can be done by pressing the skates into the pad surface and making a fast figure 8 motion for approximately 30 to 40 seconds. This process will fully work in the skates to the pad surface, increasing their control and giving them a slightly smoother feel. And for audio feedback, here's how some hardened PTFE material skate types sound here on the Atlas Pro. And lastly, when using UHMWPE or ultra-high molecular polyethylene material skates, these skate types are quite unique as their material is much harder and more durable and have a higher friction coefficient than the aforementioned types. The unique properties of these skates give them a rougher, more controlled glide that significantly increases the degrees of initial, dynamic, and braking frictions of the pad, which gives the Atlas Pro a balanced, controlled performance profile, one that is surprisingly well suited for both static and flicking as well as dynamic and tracking aim and game types. However, the increased control might negatively impact dynamic and tracking performance in some cases. And just like hardened PTFE material skates, this skate type also needs to be worked into a pad surface, and you can work them with the same process we used for hardened PTFE material skates. And for audio feedback, here's how some UHMWP material skates sound on the Atlas Pro. However, one odd aspect to the Atlas Pro I wanted to highlight here is that due to the surface texturing design, and just like we saw in the original Atlas, you can't increase the pad's friction coefficient by pressing your mouse into its surface, whereas on many other hard pad types, especially more modern ones, they feature surface texturings that allow for increased frictions when downward pressure is applied to your mouse. And again, seeing as this is an Atlas V2 of sorts, the lack of any dynamic friction from downward force is a notable downside when compared to other hard pad types, as it makes the pad less controllable overall. This is why, as I said earlier, it would have been nice to see Razer tweak the surfacing here, not only to modernize its performance profile, but also to allow for a degree of dynamic friction, as the lack of this is quite disappointing for a hard pad released in 2026. And while we're on the topic of comparisons to modern hard pad types, another unique marketing claim Razer is making here for the Atlas Pro is that the pad's thinner design ergonomically improves its usage, as it supposedly reduces wrist lift and supports a more balanced posture. However, they're not providing any data to back up these claims, but given the vagueness of their marketing, this isn't exactly surprising. Now, in fairness to Razer, there is some truth to the supposed ergonomic advantages, at least when compared to the original Atlas, which due to its 5mm thickness was rather awkward to use, especially around its edges. But when compared to modern pad types, all of which use thinner glass types along with beveled edges, I can't say I noticed any ergonomic or postural benefits to the Atlas Pro, but in fairness, compared to older style hard pads with rounded edges, the Atlas Pro's usage experience was better, but again, this is compared to older hard pad types, not modern ones. And there's also the factor that postural and ergonomic benefits will vary from person to person, so while I don't see any real advantages to the pad's 1.9mm thickness, others might see some benefits from this, but it will vary from person to person. And as a last note, and as mentioned earlier, unlike almost every other hard pad on the market, all of which includes some kind of hard pad optimized skate, the Atlas Pro includes none, which is extremely disappointing to see, as not only is this an expected accessory for any hard pad type, especially one this expensive, it's also disappointing due to Razer having some of the best stock skates on the market, as they perform amazingly on both soft and hard pad types. And if they were to include a set of 20 or even 40 6.5mm dot skates of the same design as their stock ones, I'd be over the moon, as the Viper V4 stock skates feel and perform great on the Atlas Pro, and including a dot version of them would have been a great attention to detail and would help bring the pad's accessories more in line to what's expected for a hard pad released in 2026. Moving on to edges, and just as we saw in the previous Atlas, the Atlas Pro features CNC rounded edges. Now, since the glass here is much thinner than its predecessor, the edges here should, in theory, be much less intrusive, but despite the thinner form factor, the edges still do have a ledge-like feeling to them that is quite noticeable in moving your arm vertically against the pad's edges. This was quite surprising for me to find, as I assumed the pad's thinner nature would make the edges unnoticeable, but since they're still rounded, not beveled, the transition from the desktop to the pad is steeper than expected, and isn't anywhere near as fluid as the transition found on thicker hard pads with beveled edges, in my opinion. It's also worth noting if you move your mouse off the side of the pad, since the edges are more ledge-like, despite their roundness, smaller skate types can still catch on the edge of the pad, which makes repositioning your mouse quite difficult. Now, to be fair, due to the improved dimensions of the Pro version, this is very much a nitpick, but compared to hard pads with beveled edges, where the skates can glide onto the pad's surface easily without catching on the edges, this is yet another downside to the Atlas Pro. Now, sadly, since the glass is only 1.1mm thick, I don't think Razer could have beveled the edges, as doing so would have made the glass much more prone to damage, as the edges of any glass type are its weak point, so to speak, and the rounded edges here act as a protective cap of sorts. This lackluster edge implementation among the other downsides of the thinner glass is why Razer should have used a thicker glass type here, as a thicker 2mm glass pane would have been more durable, its edges could have been beveled, which would have made the Atlas Pro better in my opinion, but again, Razer's focus when designing the pad was thinness, and while they achieved an ultra thin design, there have been a myriad of sacrifices made to achieve this goal, which is a trade-off I'm just not convinced was worth it given the pad's myriad of aforementioned issues. For the base, to my surprise, Razer has opted to keep a similar base implementation to the one used on the original Atlas here, with the only modification made to it being a slight size difference in its raised honeycomb texturing. This decision is a little surprising to me as this base style is very generic, but regardless the base does perform well and anchors the pad in place pretty well and prevents it from shifting during use, though the lack of shifting is more so due to the pad's thinner profile, but regardless the base does perform well, but this is definitely a very cheap base type to see used on a pad this expensive, as there are pads that are cheaper than the RAZER Atlas that use full polyurethane bases. And since this is the same base style as the V1, it has the same issue as over long-term use the edges of the base can become quite dirty, as debris can get trapped in between the honeycomb cells. Thankfully, buildup won't affect the base's anchoring strength or performance, but it does make the base of the pad look quite dirty, which from an aesthetic perspective might be an issue, but thankfully it can be cleaned relatively easily, but it is something I wanted to know as this is the same issue we saw in the Atlas V1. As such, and just like many other aspects of the Atlas Pro, since this is a V2 and considering the pad's very premium price tag, I expected Razer to use a more modern, more premium base style such as a full polyurethane base or something similar to the bases used by other premium price hard pads, but they opted to use this older, cheaper base style, which is fine, it's just a little underwhelming considering the pad's price. For moisture, overall the Atlas Pro, just like its predecessor due to its supposed oleophobic and hydrophobic coating and subtle texturing, is relatively moisture resistant as in most environments the pad handles moisture decently well, not to the same degree as more modern hard pad types do, but more so than expected, meaning the pad is relatively skin friendly. However, if you have sweatier hands or play in a very humid environment, the pad can become quite sticky, meaning you'll have to use an arm sleeve for consistent performance, but in most cases the usage experience will be the same with or without an arm sleeve from my testing, but of course there can be some variance to this aspect of the pad depending on your environment, so keep that in mind. But while an arm sleeve likely won't be required here with the Atlas Pro, I still would have liked to see one included with the pad for users who have sweatier arms and hands or live in a humid environment, as including a sleeve would have helped to address the severe lack of accessories here with the Atlas Pro and would have helped to offset the pad's debris buildup issues, which we're going to talk about next. Alright, and lastly for the effects of debris, as typical for most hard pad types, the Atlas Pro is quite resistant to smaller debris particles, but larger debris particles such as crumbs or pet fur are still an issue, as if caught under your mouse skate they'll cause a loud scratching noise, but this is typical for all hard pad types, so this was to be expected. Now you can prevent any debris related issues by simply cleaning the pad before and during use. Now normally hard pads include a cleaning cloth for this exact reason, but since the Atlas Pro doesn't include one, you'll need to supply your own, which is quite disappointing to see, especially for a pad of this price point. But unfortunately, just like the original Atlas, the Pro still has buildup issues, which is really surprising as I assume this is something Razer would have addressed here, especially considering this is a V2 so to speak. But since Razer decided to keep the same surfacing and coating type here, seeing this issue isn't exactly surprising, but it does mean that if you use the pad without an arm sleeve, dead skin, sweat, and oils from your hands and arms will create slow, gluey spots in the pad's surfacing. Now, build-up issues are more commonplace on older style hard pads like the original Atlas, and while it can definitely be an issue, it can be handled by cleaning the pad frequently and deep cleaning it at least once a month as Razer recommends, which you can do by wiping the pad surface with a wet microfiber cloth. You can also help debris from building up by wearing an arm sleeve as it acts as a barrier between your skin and the pad surface, so even though sleeves are needed in most cases from a performance perspective, I would highly recommend wearing one to mitigate said debris buildup issues. This is another reason why I'm so confused Razer didn't include a sleeve, as they obviously knew about this buildup issue as it was on the V1, and since they kept the same surfacing and coating, you'd think they'd include some kind of accessory to mitigate this or alter the pad's texture and coating to address this issue, but for reasons that are beyond me, they just didn't. So if you plan on getting the Atlas Pro, I would highly recommend getting a good quality arm sleeve along with it to help mitigate the buildup issues. And as a last note here, Razer specifically states that you shouldn't use any soap or harsh cleaning chemicals on the Atlas's surface, so when you do your monthly cleaning, stick to a wet microfiber cloth and be sure not to use any chemicals on it, as they could potentially damage the pad's coating. Alright, in closing, overall the RAZER Atlas Pro, much to my disappointment, is a very underwhelming pad, especially in today's hard pad market. As while the pad has great availability and a 30-day trial period, it comes in an improved size and also has decent performance, though said performance profile is a little outdated compared to more modern hard pad types. It also comes in an ultra-thin 1.9mm form factor, but there have been a lot of sacrifices made to achieve this, but the thinner form factor does improve its usage experience coming from the original RAZER Atlas. The pad's base implementation is good, but it's a little cheap for a pad at this price point, and the pad is decently moisture resistant, allowing the pad to be somewhat skin friendly. However, the pad is very expensive compared to competitors' offerings, the packaging is lacking in regards to protection, the thinner aluminosilicate glass texturing and coating all have questionable quality, manufacturing consistency, and durability. The pad still has debris buildup issues just as the V1 did due to the reuse of the same texturing and coating, meaning you're forced to wear an arm sleeve and clean the pad frequently to prevent slow spots from forming in the surface. The rounded edges feel outdated compared to the bevel edges found on more modern hard pad types, but most disappointingly, the pad doesn't include any accessories such as a cleaning cloth, skates, or an arm sleeve, which is frankly insane considering the pad's price, and seeing as competitors' hard pads that retail for significantly less than the Atlas Pro, might I add, include such accessories, and this is a massive oversight from RAZER, especially considering how you'll need to use an arm sleeve and a cleaning cloth due to the surface's debris buildup issues. Now, to be fair, many of my issues with the Atlas Pro is due to its ambiguous nature, as the lack of any definite marketing or manufacturing or material details raises a lot of red flags on my end, as when I review a hard pad or anything for that matter, I like to talk in depth about its materials, manufacturing, etching, and coating application processes, as these can make or break a hard pad, and I like to do my best to remove any ambiguity about these topics. But since there's so little information to go off of here and RAZER is strangely not providing any additional information about the pad, I'm left asking myself a rather uncomfortable question as to why RAZER is being so vague with the marketing and the lack of details. I just haven't been able to decipher a reason as to why. All that to say, based on my testing, you can think of the Atlas Pro as just a thinner version of the original Atlas with better dimensions and upgraded quote-unquote material and a thinner form factor, but with all the same issues found on the V1, as RAZER really hasn't made any real improvements to the pad aside from using a thinner glass material, which in itself has a lot of downsides. This, combined with its very ambiguous nature, makes the Atlas Pro really difficult to recommend, especially given its insanely high MSRP. As while it performs decently, there are just too many issues and unchecked variables for me to recommend this pad with a clear conscience. And even in the case where I'm wrong about the material, texturing, and coating used here, and in actuality RAZER is using the highest quality materials and manufacturing processes for the Atlas Pro, even then I still wouldn't recommend the pad, as its MSRP is still way too high for what you get. The pad doesn't come with any accessories, and there are just way too many issues here on the Atlas Pro, many of which have carried over from the V1 and have just been left unpatched for reasons that are beyond me. The only time I potentially recommend getting this pad is if you found it on sale for like 40 or 50% off, as at that price point it's a decent buy, but keep in mind all the issues and you'll still have to buy an arm sleeve and hard pad optimized skates for the pad, as it includes no accessories. Now, I know I'm being really harsh about this pad, mainly due to its ambiguous nature, but on a positive note, I am happy to see RAZER re-enter the hard pad market, but to compete they have to do a lot more than just re-releasing a 3-year-old hard pad in a different form factor, but I hope they take everyone's feedback and develop a new hard pad from the ground up, as a properly designed modern hard pad, one that includes proper accessories, would actually be really good, but we'll have to wait and see what RAZER has planned for the future of the Atlas series. But in the meantime, if you're in the market for a new hard pad and are considering the Atlas Pro, you'll be much better off going with other options, as any other premium hard pad will be a better overall purchase in my opinion, even though they come in thicker form factors. My personal recommendation as of right now would be the Glassworks Polarity, as that is the best hard pad I've used to date, but realistically any other premium hard pad will be a better buy, and if you care about thinness and were considering the Atlas Pro for its thinner form factor, I would hold off buying any pads for a couple months, as RAZER won't be holding on to the crown of having the world's thinnest hard pad for very long, so keep an eye out for other, thinner form factor, higher quality hard pads coming very soon. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to RAZER for sending the Atlas Pro over for review. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and getting subscribed to the channel, and share the video with a friend. And if you'd like to support my efforts on the channel with these in-depth in-depth reviews and the teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts, and being a channel member gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do here and get early access to new videos, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the RAZER Atlas Pro, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.